I can still recall the precise second. I stopped waiting for someone to rescue me from my own life. It wasn't when I found the receipts for the hotel in Charleston. It wasn't when Russell finally said the word divorce, out loud, like he was ordering a sandwich. It wasn't even when my niece Bethany, the girl I'd once driven 4 hours through an ice storm to bring home from college for Christmas, into that conference room, wearing a blazer that cost more than my first car, and looked at me like I was a stain she was stepping around. It was the moment right after that, when my attorney, a wiry, soft-spoken man named Walter Higgs, who I had never once heard raise his voice in 2 years of knowing him, let out a laugh so sudden and so sharp it cracked the air in that glass-walled room like a dropped plate. I watched Bethany's face. I watched the smug little curve of her mouth, the one she'd been wearing since she sat down beside my husband, like she'd been invited. Falter, just at the corners, just enough for me to see it. My name is Constance Hale, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of two people who walked into a room already certain they'd won, and found out the game had never belonged to them in the first place. I should tell you what my life looked like from the outside, because it looked like something out of a magazine, and for a long time I believed in the picture as much as anyone else did. Greenville, South Carolina. A renovated 4-square house on a tree-lined street near downtown. The kind with a wraparound porch and a kitchen I had gutted and redone myself over a long, hot summer. Not because we couldn't afford a contractor, but because I needed to understand how the bones of a thing fit together before I could trust it. That has always been how I work. From the inside out, slow and careful, until I know exactly what's holding everything up. Russell Pruitt came from a family that had been in the textile and home furnishings business in upstate South Carolina for 3 generations. The kind of money that didn't show off, but quietly owned half the commercial real estates in 3 counties. His grandfather had started Pruitt Home Goods as a single mill outside of Spartanburg, sewing curtains and bedding for local department stores. By the time Russell's father, Donald Pruitt, was finished building it, Pruitt Home Goods was doing better than $400 million a year, with distribution centers across the Southeast, and a private label deal with 2 of the biggest retail chains in the country. Donald was 71 when I married Russell, still mentally sharp as a tack, but tired in his bones the way a man gets after 40 years of carrying something heavy. He had started stepping back, and everyone, the trade publications, the cousins, the men he golfed with on Thursdays, assumed Russell would simply slide into his place. Russell had the title, President and Chief Operating Officer. His name went out on the press releases. His photograph appeared in the regional business journal standing in front of a warehouse, with his arms crossed, like he'd built it brick by brick himself, and behind him, in the way that women doing the actual work tend to be invisible, was me. I had spent 11 years before Russell working in supply chain analysis for a mid-sized manufacturer in Charlotte. The kind of job where you spend your days finding the small, quiet places where a company is bleeding money without realizing it. I was good at it. Genuinely good. I had a talent, even back then, for reading the gap between what a business said it was doing on paper and what it was actually doing on the ground. When Russell and I got married, I left that job. Not because he asked me to, because Pruitt Home Goods needed someone who could see what I could see. And because, God help me, I loved the work. I loved walking a warehouse floor and finding the bottleneck nobody else had noticed in 4 years. I loved the particular private satisfaction of fixing something that had been broken so long. Everyone had stopped seeing it as broken at all. What I did over the next 5 years wasn't glamorous, not even a little. It was spreadsheets at 11 at night after the dishes were done. It was driving myself to Memphis and Knoxville to meet with vendors, because Russell hated flying and hated driving even more. It was a full overhaul of the company's southern distribution network that took 16 months and saved Pruitt Home Goods just over $11 million. It was renegotiating a fabric and textile supplier contract that hadn't been touched in 13 years, and was quietly costing the company nearly 7% a quarter in margin. Nobody had bothered to question. I never asked for my name on anything. I never needed credit. I had Russell, I told myself. I had the work. I genuinely believed that was enough to build a life on. Bethany came into our family when I was 22, and my sister Patricia married her father. She was 9 then. A quiet, watchful little girl who used to crawl into bed with me during thunderstorms. Because her own mother had passed when she was small, and she said I smelled like safety. We weren't close, exactly. Not in the way people imagine close, but we were family, and I trusted that the way you trust something you've simply never had reason to question. I should have questioned it. I found out on a Tuesday in late September. The dogwoods along our street had just started to turn. And I'd come home a full day early from a supplier trip to Memphis, because the meetings had wrapped faster than expected. And I thought I'd surprise Russell. I remember thinking I'd pick up barbecue from the place on Augusta Street he liked, and we'd have a quiet evening on the porch. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because I don't need to give you every detail to make it stand. What I'll say is that there was no ambiguity in what I walked into. There was no story I could tell myself that made it something else. And what moved through me standing in my own front hallway wasn't the loud, weeping kind of devastation you see in movies. It was quieter than that. Colder. Russell looked up and saw me standing there, and the very first thing that crossed his face, before guilt, for any kind of calculation, was irritation. As if I had interrupted something that had nothing to do with me. As if I were the inconvenience in my own home. Bethany stood up slowly. She didn't rush, didn't reach for her clothes, didn't do any of the things you'd expect from someone caught. She smoothed her skirt with both hands and looked at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on her face before, not once in 20 years. Level, unbothered, almost clinical. You were always going to end up here, Connie, she said, in a voice as flat and even as a kitchen counter. Some people build things. Other people are just better suited to having them. That's not cruelty. That's just how it works. I drove to a Hampton Inn off Woodruff Road and sat in my car in the parking lot for almost an hour before I could make myself dial a number. The person I called was Walter Higgs, my personal attorney. Not the company's lawyer, not Russell's family's lawyer. I'd hired Walter 5 years earlier, on the advice of a mentor from my Charlotte days. A woman who had told me, over coffee on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday, that any woman doing serious financial work inside a Affley's business needed her own independent counsel, full stop. No matter how solid the marriage looked. That advice turned out to be the single most important piece of guidance anyone ever gave me. What followed was 8 weeks of very quiet, very careful work, while Russell and Bethany moved through Greenville like nothing had happened. Showing up together at a company product launch, being seen at the Symphony fundraiser, behaving like people who believed the story was already finished. Walter and I were building something else entirely in the background. Not out of spite. By that point, honestly, not even out of anger anymore, out of precision. The conference room where the settlement meeting was held sat on the 11th floor of an office building downtown, with windows looking out over the Reedy River and the falls. It was the kind of crisp, overcast late October morning South Carolina gets sometimes, where the sky is white and flat and the light makes everything look slightly washed out. Bethany arrived before I did. I heard later she'd come almost 30 minutes early. She was dressed in a fitted charcoal blazer, small diamond studs, dark trousers pressed to a knife's edge. Her hair was different, straighter, more severe than I'd ever seen her wear it. She looked dressed for a corporate acquisition, not somebody else's divorce. She sat down beside Russell at the far end of the table, which she had absolutely no legal standing to do. She wasn't a party to this divorce. She had no attorney present representing her in that room. She was there because this was theater for her, and she had dressed for the part. Russell's attorney was a man named Charles Webb, a well-regarded divorce specialist with a reputation for efficiency, retained, I'd learn later, at a fee that reflected exactly how confident he was in the outcome. He'd reviewed what Russell's side had disclosed about our marital estate, and built a settlement offer that was technically defensible and financially almost nothing. Clean. Fast. Built for a woman they assumed didn't fully understand what she was owed. Walter and I sat down across from them. He set a single folder, edges tabbed in red, flat on the table in front of him and did not open it. Preliminary papers were passed across. Charles made his opening remarks. Something measured about equitable distribution and Russell's central role in the company's continued success. Walter let him finish every sentence without once interrupting. Then Bethany reached into her handbag. I don't know what was going through her mind. Maybe the silence in the room felt too neutral for her taste. Maybe this was something she'd rehearsed in front of a mirror. Maybe she simply couldn't let the moment pass without leaving her mark on it. She drew out a single bill, crisp, fresh from the bank. She held it up between two fingers and slid it across the polished table until it stopped directly in front of my legal pad. She looked at me with a smile that had absolutely nothing warm in it. "Take the 100, Connie," she said. "Call yourself a ride home to Mom's. We're done here." The room went completely still. Charles Webb actually flinched. A small, involuntary twitch at the corner of his left eye. The kind a seasoned professional tries to suppress and doesn't quite manage. Russell's jaw went tight. Not with shame, but with the particular tension of a man whose script had just been changed without his approval. And then Walter Higgs laughed. Not a polite sound. Not a throat-clearing little chuckle. A real laugh, sharp and sudden and completely unguarded, that bounced off the glass walls and filled that room with something nobody in it had planned for. Russell sat bolt upright, his chair scraping hard against the floor. "What exactly is funny to you right now?" Walter took off his glasses, took one slow breath and put them back on. Then he reached for the red folder, set it precisely in the center of the table, and turned it so the embossed heading faced Russell's side of the room. "I apologize," he said, his voice dropping low and very clear. "I wasn't planning to enter this into the record quite yet. But that statement changes the posture of this conversation considerably, and very much in my client's favor." Bethany's voice sharpened. "Explain that." Walter looked at her for a long, unhurried beat. "I'm laughing," he said softly, "because you and your client seem to be operating under the sincere belief that Russell Pruitt holds controlling authority over Pruitt Home Goods." He tapped the folder's cover once with one finger. "He doesn't." The silence that followed was an entirely different animal from the one before. Before, the quiet had been the held breath kind. Two people waiting for me to fold. This silence was hollow, like someone had quietly removed a support beam from one side of the room and everyone was waiting to see if this held. Charles Webb leaned forward immediately. "That's a substantial claim. I'll need to see whatever documentation." "You're already holding part of it," Walter said. "Here is what's actually in that folder." Donald Pruitt, Russell's father, the man who spent 40 years building this company out of a single mill outside Spartanburg, never formally transferred controlling authority to his son, not legally. Not in any binding sense. Russell has the title. He has the press coverage. He has the corner office and the embossed business cards, and his name on every release that goes out. What he does not have is the votes. Roughly 4 years before our divorce, Donald had quietly restructured ownership of the company into a family trust. The trust held 58% of all voting shares. Controlling interest. Every major decision, every acquisition, every significant structural change required the trustee's sign-off. And the trustee, the one person holding full fiduciary authority over that controlling stake, was not Russell. It was me. Donald made that decision during the same year. I'd spent rebuilding the company's southern distribution network. Watching me from his office window without ever saying a word about it. He'd watched how I read a vendor contract, how I could walk a warehouse floor and put my finger on exactly where a system was failing, how I fixed things in ways that actually held, instead of just looking fixed for a quarter or two. He was a builder himself, in the oldest sense of that word, and he recognized one when he saw one. Without telling Russell, without telling another living soul, he decided the person who genuinely understood his company deserved the legal protection to match what she understood. Donald Pruitt executed the trust restructuring 4 years ago this past spring. Walter said, sliding pages across the table one at a time, slow and deliberate. Constance Hale Pruitt was named sole trustee of the Pruitt Family Holdings Trust. That trust controls 58% of all voting shares in Pruitt Home Goods. Mr. Pruitt retains his title and a minority equity position. He cannot authorize a merger, approve a sale, restructure company debt, or execute any transaction above $300,000 without trustee sign-off. He paused. Without Constance's sign-off. Charles was reading fast now, scanning page after page with the kind of focused, urgent energy of a man realizing his entire case needs to be rebuilt from the studs up. His expression wasn't quite panic. It was the controlled, professional cousin of panic, which is somehow worse to watch. Russell had gone completely still. Not the restless stillness of a man biding his time. The rigid, airless stillness of someone trying to process information that's just rewritten everything he believed about his own life. Bethany looked at Russell, then at the documents, then back at Russell again. For the first time in 20 years of knowing her, through every Thanksgiving and graduation and ordinary Tuesday that had brought us all to this room, she had absolutely nothing to say. No clever line. No exit, nothing. "There's one more matter," Walter said. 4 years earlier, before he'd started doing any substantive work on my behalf, he'd advised me to formalize my contributions to the company through an independent consulting agreement. Not as a wife doing her husband a favor, not as a family member pitching in around the edges, as a contracted professional, with a documented scope of work, deliverables, and a compensation structure spelled out in writing. At the time I'd signed it almost as a formality. Something Walter said was simply smart to have on file. A piece of paper in a drawer I barely thought about again. That piece of paper, and 4 years of documented work attached to it, was the second item in that folder. My client entered into a formal consulting agreement with Pruitt Home Goods prior to beginning any of this work, Walter said. The scope covered operational restructuring, vendor contract renegotiation, and strategic distribution planning. Her documented contributions include a distribution redesign that reduced logistics costs by an estimated $11 million over 5 years, and a supplier contract correction that addressed a margin loss the company had been absorbing, unnoticed, for over a decade. He looked at Charles Webb directly. Compensation owed under that agreement is separate from, and independent of, any calculation of marital assets. It's a contractual obligation of the company itself, not of Russell personally, which means the settlement your client proposed this morning doesn't come close to reflecting my client's actual legal and financial position. Charles asked for a recess. Still gave him 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, Bethany didn't say a single word to Russell. She sat with her hands folded on the table, staring at some fixed point past the window, out at the flat gray sky over the falls. The $100 bill was still sitting there in front of my legal pad. Nobody reached for it. I won't walk you through every line of the final settlement. Some of it stays confidential by mutual agreement. And that's fine by me. What I'll tell you is what mattered. Russell kept his title at Pruitt Home Goods and his minority stake. He kept the condo he'd moved into downtown, and the truck, and his collection of bourbon he liked to talk about at parties, and all the visible surface-level trappings of a life he'd built around an image of himself. What he lost was everything underneath that image. The authority he'd let everyone, including Bethany, believe he actually held. The story he'd been telling about who he was and what he controlled. That story was over. The consulting agreement was honored in full. The trust structure was acknowledged and formalized as part of the public settlement record. I walked out of that building with a financial outcome that actually reflected 5 years of real, documented, consequential work. Not the outcome of a woman handed $100 and told to call herself a cab. Bethany left the building before the final signatures were even exchanged. I didn't watch her go. I just heard the door. I heard, much later, through a mutual cousin neither of us talks to much anymore, that she and Russell didn't last past the following spring. No announcement, no public falling out. It just stopped, the way things built on a false foundation tend to, eventually, quietly, without ceremony. Donald Pruitt called me about 2 weeks after the settlement was finalized. He didn't say much. He asked how I was holding up. He said he was glad Walter had been thorough. There was a long pause on the line, and then he said, in that unhurried way of his, "You always saw this place more clearly than anyone who ever had their name on the door, Connie." I just made sure the paperwork finally agreed with me. I stayed on as trustee for another 16 months. Donald and I worked well together, the way we always had. When we hit a natural stopping point, I stepped back by my own choice, left the trust in a clean, well-documented state, and walked out of Pruitt Home Goods for the last time on a Friday afternoon in early spring, when the dogwoods along the river were just starting to open again. I live on the other side of Greenville now, in a smaller house with a good kitchen and a desk by a window, where the morning light comes in just right. I consult independently these days, mostly for companies that need someone who can read between the lines of a balance sheet, find the assumption nobody's questioned in a decade, and figure out what's actually happening underneath the story a business likes to tell about itself. I'm good at it. I have always been good at seeing what's actually there. Here's what I want to leave you with. Bethany slid that $100 bill across the table because she'd already decided what I was. Finished, replaceable. A chapter she got to close on her own terms. She'd written the ending before she ever walked into that room, and all she wanted from me was confirmation. What she never once considered, what people like her almost never consider, is everything that happened before the room. The years of quiet, documented, unglamorous work that nobody photographed or toasted or put a name to. The agreements filed away in a drawer. The restructuring that saved millions, attributed to no one. She saw the surface of a life and assumed she understood the whole of it. She was wrong. And the moment Walter Higgs laughed, that sharp, real, involuntary sound that rang off the glass walls of that conference room, 11 floors above the reedy river, that was the exact moment the room finally found out the truth. The people who underestimate you aren't always wrong about everything. Sometimes they're right that you're quiet. Right that you don't take up much space in a room. Right that you never made a show of what you were building. They're just wrong about what any of that actually means. So I want to ask you something. And I genuinely want to read your answer. Has someone ever underestimated you so completely that when the truth finally came out, even you were a little surprised by what you'd quietly built? Tell me your story. I read every comment, every single one. And if this one stayed with you, you already know what to do.